Starvation is a slow, cruel killer. It does not strike like a sword or burn like fire. It creeps. It waits. It steals a little piece of the mind each day, making the world blur at the edges, turning thoughts heavy and strange. When hunger buries itself deep in the bones, when the body begins consuming its own muscles to stay alive, the rules humans swear they would never break suddenly loosen, then bend, then snap. History remembers people for their victories, their inventions, their wars. But some of the most terrifying stories ever told are about ordinary people trapped in moments where survival demanded the unthinkable. One of the most horrifying chapters began in 1846 with the Donner Party. They were not criminals or warriors. They were families, mothers, fathers, children, headed for California with wagons full of hope. Their mistake was trusting a shortcut across the mountains. The so-called Hastings Cutoff led them into a wasteland of cliffs, desert heat, and boulder-strewn terrain that shredded their animals' hooves and shattered their spirits. Days turned into weeks. Their oxen died. Their wagons splintered, and winter arrived early, sealing the Sierra Nevada behind walls of snow more than 20 feet thick. The pioneers built makeshift cabins from logs and torn wagon parts, but the cold seeped in through every crack. They slaughtered their remaining animals for meat, then boiled animal hides, then chewed on leather soaked in hot water. Their bodies shrank.
Ow!
Their cheeks hollowed. Children woke up crying, not from pain, but from the ache of emptiness inside their stomachs. As December dragged on, people began to die, first the weakest, then the sick, then the ones who simply gave up. Death came quietly in the night, like a thief. One morning, Franklin Graves, who had been strong as an ox, failed to rise. Another day, a mother found her child frozen beside her. Eventually, the survivors faced a decision so frightening that they spoke of it only in whispers: to eat or to die. They carved thin strips of flesh from the dead, too numb to cry, too far gone to feel shame. They prayed before every cut, hoping that God would forgive them. Some survivors could not bring themselves to swallow, retching in the snow. Others did what they had to, chewing slowly, eyes vacant, minds drifting somewhere deep inside themselves. When rescue parties finally reached the cabins months later, they found bones, frozen limbs, and survivors with haunted eyes who could barely speak. The world judged them harshly, but those who truly understood starvation did not. Across the world, decades later, another city faced starvation on a monstrous scale. During World War II, the siege of Leningrad trapped nearly 3 million people inside the city, like insects beneath a jar. Hitler believed he could starve the entire population into extinction. Winter temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Fuel ran out. Few disappeared. People tore apart leather belts, boiled wallpaper paste for the glue, chewed on sawdust bread that crumbled like dry dirt. Entire apartments went silent, except for the sound of coughing and the slow, dragging footsteps of someone too weak to stand. Parents wrapped their children in blankets made of curtains, humming lullabies even as they starved. Soon, cats and dogs vanished from the streets, then rats, then even crows. By January, hunger had turned the city into something no one recognized. People collapsed on sidewalks and froze where they fell. Bodies piled in the corners of hospitals, half buried in snow. Crime changed not for money, but for scraps. Rumors spread of shadowy figures lurking in alleys, waiting not to rob the living, but to steal the dead. Police records from that time are chilling. Arrests for cannibalism rose daily. Some cases involved people who had never committed a crime in their lives. They were teachers, seamstresses, factory workers, ordinary citizens ravaged by a hunger that hollowed their souls. They did not kill. They only took flesh from those who had already died of starvation. Even then, they hid their actions, terrified of the shame, but more terrified of dying before the siege ended. When the blockade finally broke after 872 days, survivors stepped out into a world of ruins, carrying memories they would never speak aloud. History remembers their endurance, but in private, many remember the dark moments they wished they could forget. Then there's the Andes tragedy, one of the most studied survival stories in modern history. In 1972, a plane carrying a rugby team, their friends and family, crashed high in the Andes Mountains. The survivors were stranded on a glacier with almost no food, freezing winds that sliced through clothing, and nights so cold that frost formed inside their noses as they slept. At first, they rationed chocolate bars, sipped melted snow, tore apart seats for insulation. But as days passed, hope dwindled. Their rescue searches had been called off. No one was coming. The mountains were too vast, the wreckage too hidden. Hunger gnawed at their bodies like an animal trying to tear its way out. Some tried to pray the hunger away. Others drifted into delirium, whispering the names of loved ones who would never know their fate. Then came the moment everyone feared. The bodies of their dead friends lay preserved in the snow, untouched, frozen, intact. The survivors held a meeting, trembling not from cold, but from the horror of what they were about to consider. They argued, they cried. They begged God to show them another path. But in the end, reality won. One survivor said with tears streaming down his face, "If I die, you must use me too." In that declaration, something inside them broke, and something else hardened. They cut tiny pieces, ate slowly, sobbed after swallowing, and some vomited from the shock. But they stayed alive. For 72 days, they endured avalanches, frostbite, sun blindness, and grief that carved scars deeper than any wound. When 2 survivors finally walked out of the mountains to get help, the world was stunned, not by their choice, but by their strength, their honesty, and their humanity. They had stared into the abyss and climbed out again. Long before any of these tragedies, long before modern borders or languages existed, ancient tribes also faced famine that pushed them to extremes. In prehistoric Europe, harsh winters sometimes wiped out entire bands of hunter-gatherers. Archaeologists have found bones cracked open for marrow, a sign of starvation so severe that even the bones were not spared. In some caves, human bones were found treated exactly like animal bones, scraped, boiled, smashed, burned. These were not acts of cruelty, but acts of survival in a world without farming, without storage, without rescue. When the land turned barren and the forests silent, tribes faced a truth older than civilization: nature does not care. Winter arrives whether food is ready or not. And when people starved, they did what they had to, knowing that judgment belonged to no one, because the world was empty and wild. Even sailors, trapped at sea, have faced this unthinkable choice. The story of the whale ship Essex, the tragedy that inspired Moby Dick, is one of the most haunting. When a furious sperm whale rammed the ship in 1820, the men escaped in small boats, drifting across thousands of miles of open ocean. Salt water burned their lips. Sunlight roasted their skin until it peeled in strips. Fish were scarce. Birds rarely landed. The men began dying one by one, falling asleep under the sun and never waking up. After weeks, the survivors, delirious, skeletal, half-mad, confronted cannibalism. They ate the flesh of men they had laughed with, sailed with, lived with. One boat even drew lots to see who would be sacrificed so the others could live. The ocean turned them into ghosts who drifted between life and death until rescue finally arrived, pulling them from a world so nightmarish that some sailors refused to speak of it for the rest of their lives. What connects all these stories, from frozen mountains to starving cities to endless oceans, is not savagery, but desperation. People who resorted to cannibalism were not monsters. They were human beings in situations that stripped away everything except the primal instinct to survive. Hunger rewires the mind. It clouds judgment. It blurs memory. It makes the world shrink until all that exists is the next hour, the next breath, the next heartbeat. Moral rules that feel unbreakable in times of comfort dissolve under the crushing weight of starvation. And yet, in every one of these stories, survivors later spoke of guilt. They spoke of nightmares, of broken spirits, of memories that clawed at them years later. Their suffering did not end when they were rescued. It lingered in the quiet moments, the dark nights, the spaces where the mind wanders. Cannibalism in history is not simply a tale of horror. It is a story about the edge of humanity. It shows how fragile civilization is, how quickly order collapses when hunger conquers the body. It is a reminder that the line between human and animal becomes thin when nature, war, or fate strips everything else away. But above all, these stories reveal this truth. Even in the darkest moments, survival is not beautiful. It is raw, brutal, and filled with choices no one should ever face. and yet people survived. They carried those memories like scars, silent and permanent, living proof of what human beings can endure when they stand face to face with death and refuse to surrender. And yet, even after all those survivors crawled back into the world of the living, after their wounds healed, and their stomachs were no longer empty, the shadow of what they had done followed them like a ghost that refused to be buried. It whispered in quiet rooms, in empty hallways, in moments when they looked into a mirror and wondered whether they were still the same person who had boarded a wagon, or sat on a plane, or lived inside a besieged city. Some tried to pretend those days never happened. Others spoke of them only once, and never again. But deep inside, every one of them carried a private truth. When starvation comes, when death sits beside you and watches you shiver, the mind becomes a battlefield between what you believe you are and what your body demands you become. It is easy, from a distance, to say I would never. People sitting in warm houses with full stomachs believe their morals are unbreakable. But history shows that hunger does not negotiate, does not debate. It crushes, it consumes, transforms the human brain into something primal and desperate. There is a moment every starving person reaches, a moment when the stomach stops growling, when the numbness turns to dizziness, when the world begins to feel far away. It is in that moment that the mind drifts into dangerous territory. Hallucinations emerge. Names of loved ones sound faint. Time warps. The body begs. Logic melts. And the person you once were becomes only a memory. In the Arctic, where explorers vanished into white storms, cannibalism became an unspoken fate that governments denied for decades. The Franklin expedition of 1845, sent to map the Northwest Passage, disappeared after becoming trapped in ice. For years, Britain insisted their sailors would never resort to such barbarity. But when Inuit witnesses finally shared what they saw, scattered bones with cut marks, empty campfires, surrounded by human remains, the truth emerged. The crew, once proud and disciplined, had starved until their military order broke apart and their instincts took over. The men who had marched with flags and trumpets now crawled across the ice, delirious and skeletal, carving meat from the dead because the alternative was to curl up in the snow and never awaken. Their frozen bones, found a century later, whispered the truth Britain refused to hear. Even the most disciplined men can descend into desperation when the white silence of starvation surrounds them. And what of the shipwrecked sailors of the 17th and 18th centuries? The oceans birthed countless tragedies no historian can fully record. Storms smashed ships against reefs, leaving survivors on islands with no food except leaves, crabs, or whatever washed ashore. Some men held out for days, then weeks, until hunger hollowed their faces. Eyewitness journals describe sailors sunburned to the point of bleeding, skin hanging loose against rib cages, their minds slipping into a fog of confusion and panic. When one man died, the others would stare at the body for hours, not out of cruelty, but out of a terrible internal struggle between morality and survival. When they finally gave in, they did so with tears running down their faces. Many wrote notes in trembling handwriting, hoping their families might one day read their apologies. But perhaps the most chilling accounts come from places where famine scorched entire landscapes and swallowed villages whole. The Great Famine of China, 1959 to 1961, turned fields into wastelands and forests into silence. Crops failed, livestock died, and villages became hollow. Families starved openly on the roads. People cooked leaves, weeds, dirt mixed with grass, anything that could trick the stomach into feeling full. Cannibalism emerged quietly, secretly, often between families too weak to bury their dead. In some villages, parents kept watch at night not to protect their children from animals, but from neighbors who might steal bodies out of desperation. These acts were not spoken about, not taught, not remembered. They were erased from official records, but they lived on in whispered stories passed down only within families. Stories of hunger so brutal that it drove entire communities to the edge of humanity. And still, the world continued to face moments where starvation forced people into impossible decisions. In 1874, the U.S. Army faced the Buffalo Soldier tragedy, where troops lost in the Texas plains starved until discipline collapsed. Some journals speak of survival methods few dared to print, methods involving the dead whose bodies were left unburied in the heat. In colonial Africa, explorers driven by greed and ambition led expeditions that went horribly wrong. Men hired as porters were abandoned by their leaders, forced to eat whatever they found, bark, insects, and eventually each other. The jungles swallowed their screams. The rivers carried away their bones. What ties all these stories together is not violence, but helplessness. Cannibalism in these situations was never about cruelty or desire. It was about trying to live in a world where nature had turned hostile and death had become a constant companion. It was about people who wanted nothing more than one more sunrise, one more day, one more chance to return home. And yet when they did return home, if they survived at all, they found themselves caught between gratitude for life and shame for what they had done. They carried guilt as heavy as the hunger that once tore at their bodies. Some survivors found redemption, built families, wrote books, became symbols of endurance. Others lived quiet lives, avoiding conversations about the past. Some never recovered, haunted by nightmares that replayed the moments when they held flesh in their shaking hands. These memories carved deep scars, not on their bodies, but on their souls. And through it all, one truth becomes clear: human beings can survive horrors far beyond imagination. They can endure storms, famine, ice, war, and the cold weight of moral collapse. But survival always comes with a cost written not on the pages of history, but in the minds of those who lived through the darkest hunger known to man. In the end, the people who lived through these impossible moments did not remember themselves as heroes or monsters, only as human beings who had been forced into a corner by starvation, cold, and fate. They survived not because they were stronger than others, but because circumstance demanded a choice they never imagined they would face. Some carried guilt for the rest of their lives. Others found forgiveness in knowing they never harmed the living and only honored the dead by using the last thing those bodies could offer. And some silently simply wished they could forget. But history does not forget. It preserves these stories not to condemn them, but to remind us of something larger than morality, larger than judgment, larger than fear, that survival is a brutal teacher. It strips away illusions and exposes the raw truth of what it means to be alive. It shows that the line separating the civilized from the desperate is thinner than anyone wants to believe. It shows that humans are capable of extraordinary strength, but also extraordinary anguish. Yet despite everything, the survivors of these tragedies walked forward. They returned to families, rebuilt lives, and watched new generations grow. Generations who would never fully understand the darkness they endured. Their suffering became warnings carved into history, silent reminders of the cost of life at the edge of death. And perhaps, in that way, their stories have found a purpose beyond survival. Because when we look back at them now, trembling, starving, terrified, but still fighting breath by breath, we do not see monsters. We see courage twisted by desperation. We see love expressed in impossible decisions. We see the most fragile, painful, and honest version of humanity. And that is why these stories endure. Not for the horror, not for the shock, but because they reveal that even in humanity's darkest hour, when hope is nearly extinguished, and morality is shattered, people still cling to life with a force stronger than fear itself. They show us that being human is not about perfection, it is about enduring the unimaginable, carrying the scars, and still choosing to walk forward into the light. That is where the story ends. Not in the snow, not on the ocean, not in the silence of a besieged city, but in the simple, stubborn act of living on.